Ellie Monroe always believed her parents' deaths were a tragic accident until she finds a hidden will that tells a different story. In the dusty corners of their old family home, secrets long buried begin to surface. Cryptic letters, missing police reports, and rumors of betrayal that implicate those closest to them. Before we begin, drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from. If you believe the truth always comes out, like and subscribe. And now, let the secrets unravel. Ellie stepped out of the car, her knees creaking slightly as she stretched. The old house loomed before her, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin, the porch sagging under years of neglect. It had been 2 decades since she'd last set foot here. 2 decades since the accident that claimed her parents' lives and left this place frozen in time. She sighed, gripping the railing as she climbed the steps, each one groaning beneath her weight. The air inside was thick with dust and memories, a strange mix of comfort and unease settling over her. Ellie ran a hand along the faded wallpaper in the hallway, her fingers tracing patterns she hadn't noticed as a child. "Just get it done," she muttered to herself, shaking off the wave of nostalgia. Selling the house wasn't just practical, it felt necessary, like closing a chapter she'd kept open far too long. Her father's study was exactly as he'd left it. Books lined up neatly on shelves, papers stacked in precise piles, his leather chair still facing the window where he used to sit and smoke his pipe. Ellie hesitated at the threshold, feeling an unexpected pang of guilt for disturbing his sanctuary, but the real estate agent had insisted. No buyer would want a house cluttered with relics of the past. She started with the desk drawers, rifling through yellowed letters, receipts, and scribbled notes. Most of it was meaningless now, fragments of a life she barely recognized. Her hands paused when she reached the bottom drawer. Something about it felt off. The wood seemed thinner here, less sturdy than the others. Frowning, she pressed against the back panel, and to her surprise, it shifted. A soft click echoed in the room. Heart pounding, Ellie pried the false back loose. Inside was a slim manila envelope, brittle with age. She opened it carefully, her breath catching as she unfolded the document within. It was a will, but not the one she knew. This one bore her parents' signatures, dated just days after their supposed death. Her stomach churned as she read the words scrawled across the page. "To our dearest Ellie," it began, and already tears pricked her eyes. But what followed made her blood run cold. There was mention of a trust account she'd never heard of, funds set aside for reasons unclear. Stranger still, someone else was named as a partial heir, a name she didn't recognize. And then came the line that stopped her heart entirely. "Should anything happen to us under unnatural circumstances?" Unnatural circumstances. The phrase reverberated in her mind, sharp and accusing. Her parents' deaths had been ruled an accident, a tragic but straightforward collision on a rain-slicked highway. That's what everyone said. That's what she'd always believed. Yet here was evidence that suggested otherwise. Evidence they'd gone to great lengths to hide. Ellie sank into her father's chair, the leather squeaking beneath her. Her hands trembled as she clutched the will, staring at the words until they blurred together. Questions swirled in her head like leaves caught in a storm. What did they know? Who were they afraid of? And why hadn't they told her? A memory surfaced, unbidden. A late-night argument she'd overheard as a teenager. Her mother's voice, low and urgent. "We can't keep ignoring this, Joseph. If something happens to us..." Her father cutting her off sharply. "Nothing is going to happen." At the time, Ellie had dismissed it as marital tension, the kind of disagreement all couples had. Now, though, it took on sinister undertones. She looked around the room, half expecting answers to leap out at her. Instead, there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. For the first time in years, Ellie felt truly alone. Not because the house was empty, but because the people who could explain this mystery were gone. Gone, or so she'd thought. Her gaze fell on the name written in the will again. Margaret Hensley. Who was she? Friend? Enemy? Someone her parents trusted or feared? Ellie knew one thing for certain. Selling the house could wait. First, she needed to understand what her parents had tried so desperately to protect her from. The next morning, Ellie drove to the address listed on the will, Hensley and Company, attorneys at law. The building was tucked away on a quiet street, its brick facade weathered and cracked, ivy creeping up the sides like nature reclaiming what once belonged to it. A faded sign hung crookedly above the door, swaying slightly in the breeze. It felt less like a law office and more like a relic from another era. Inside, the air smelled of aged paper and lemon polish. An elderly woman sat behind a desk, her silver hair pinned into a loose bun. She looked up as Ellie entered, her eyes clouded with cataracts but sharp enough to recognize the family resemblance. "You're Clara's girl," she said softly, her voice trembling with age. "I thought you'd come sooner." Margot Hensley ushered Ellie into a small office cluttered with files and dusty ledgers. She moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane, her frail body betraying years of secrets locked away in these walls. Ellie sat across from her, clutching the will tightly in her lap. "Do you know why my parents left this document?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Margot lowered herself into her chair with a groan, her gaze drifting toward the window as if searching for something long lost. "Your father, he feared someone close to him." Her words were slow, deliberate, each syllable weighed down by time. "He came to me weeks before." She trailed off, shaking her head. "He was going to tell you everything, Ellie. Everything." Ellie leaned forward, desperation edging her tone. "Tell me what? What was he afraid of?" But Margot only shook her head again, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the armrest of her chair. "Not safe here," she murmured cryptically. "Ask Daniel. He'll help you." "Daniel?" Ellie frowned. The name meant nothing to her. Margot didn't elaborate further, instead handing Ellie a slip of paper with a phone number scrawled on it. "Trust no one," she whispered, her grip surprisingly strong as she pressed the note into Ellie's hand. Before Ellie could ask anything else, Margot waved her away, muttering under her breath about unfinished business and debts unpaid. Confused but determined, Ellie left the office and dialed the number. A man answered after a few rings. Daniel Hensley, Margot's grandson. His voice was warm yet cautious, and when they met later that day at a cafe downtown, she immediately understood why Margot had sent her to him. Daniel exuded a quiet competence, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Over coffee, Ellie explained everything. The will, Margot's cryptic warnings, her growing suspicion that her parents' deaths weren't an accident. Daniel listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little until she finished. Then he leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table. "There are things people around here don't talk about," he said finally. "Things your father got tangled up in." He agreed to help her dig deeper, starting with the police reports from the night of the accident. They spent hours poring over microfiche records at the local library, squinting at grainy photocopies. What they found, or rather didn't find, was unsettling. Entire sections of the report were missing, torn out with surgical precision. Only fragments remained, skid marks on the road, broken glass scattered across the pavement. No witnesses. "It's like someone went out of their way to erase evidence," Daniel muttered, rubbing his temples. As they continued their search, pieces of the puzzle began to emerge, not through official records, but through whispers and rumors buried deep in the town's collective memory. At the diner where locals gathered for coffee, Daniel coaxed stories out of old-timers who remembered Joseph Monroe well. One name kept surfacing: Michael Monroe, Joseph's younger brother. "They had a falling out years ago," an elderly man named Harold said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Big land deal gone sour. Your dad blew the whistle on some shady stuff, and Michael never forgave him." Ellie's heart sank. Uncle Michael? The same uncle who used to take her fishing as a child, who always slipped her extra quarters for ice cream? She couldn't reconcile the kind man she remembered with the image forming in her mind now. A bitter rival consumed by greed and betrayal. Daniel uncovered more damning details, emails and documents suggesting Joseph had uncovered corruption tied to a real estate development project. Developers had been buying up farmland at rock-bottom prices, using intimidation tactics to force owners to sell. Joseph had tried to expose them, even going so far as to gather evidence to present to authorities. But before he could act, the accident happened. Each revelation hit Ellie like a punch to the gut. How much had her parents sacrificed to protect their family? And how many lies had they told to shield her from the truth? That night, lying awake in her childhood bedroom, Ellie stared at the ceiling, the weight of everything she'd learned pressing down on her chest. Her father hadn't just feared someone close, he'd trusted someone, loved someone, only to have that trust shattered. The question gnawing at her wasn't just who had betrayed him, but why, and whether she'd have the courage to face the answers when they came. The next morning, Ellie drove to Maplewood Retirement Home, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. The address had come from Daniel, who'd tracked down Joseph's old contacts. She might not remember much, he'd warned, but if anyone knows something, it's Mrs. Grayson. Mrs. Grayson, or Ruth, as she insisted Ellie call her, was sitting by the window in the common room when Ellie arrived. Her once imposing frame was now frail, her silver hair neatly pinned back, but her eyes still held the same warmth Ellie remembered from her childhood. For a moment, Ellie felt like a little girl again, running into the house after school, knowing Ruth would have cookies waiting. "Ellie Monroe," Ruth said, her voice soft but clear. "My goodness, look at you." She reached out a shaky hand, and Ellie took it, feeling an unexpected swell of emotion. They sat together on a floral-printed couch, sunlight streaming through the windows. Ellie hesitated before diving into questions, unsure how much Ruth could recall after all these years. But when she mentioned the accident, Ruth's expression shifted, her gaze growing distant. "That night," Ruth began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'll never forget it. Your father came home late, agitated. He and your mother were arguing in the kitchen. I heard them through the door." Ellie leaned closer, her pulse quickening. "What were they arguing about?" Ruth frowned, her brow furrowed as though trying to piece together fragments of a dream. "It was about Michael, your uncle. Your father said, he said Michael couldn't be trusted anymore, that he'd gone too far this time. And then there was something about a letter. Your father kept saying he needed to send it, but your mother begged him not to." "A letter?" Ellie echoed, her mind racing. "Do you know what it said?" Ruth shook her head slowly. "No, dear, but I do remember seeing it on his desk the next morning. It was addressed to someone important, a lawyer maybe, or the police. Whatever it was, he didn't get the chance to mail it." Ellie's throat tightened. Another clue, another thread left dangling. She pictured her father sitting at his desk, pen in hand, wrestling with the decision to expose whatever secrets he'd uncovered. Had he hesitated because he feared for his safety, or had he hoped to protect his family from the fallout? "Did my father say anything else that night?" Ellie pressed gently, not wanting to overwhelm Ruth. Ruth paused, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her cardigan. "He talked about you," she said finally, her voice tinged with sadness. "He said he wished he could tell you everything, but it wasn't safe yet. He promised your mother he'd wait until the right time." Until the right time. The words echoed in Ellie's mind, heavy with regret. If only she'd known then what she knew now. If only they'd trusted her enough to share the burden. After thanking Ruth and promising to visit again, Ellie stepped outside, the crisp autumn air doing little to calm the storm brewing inside her. She pulled out her phone and called Daniel. "We need to find that letter," she said without preamble. "It has to be somewhere in the house." Daniel agreed to meet her later that afternoon, but Ellie couldn't wait. She drove straight back to the family home, her thoughts consumed by images of her father writing that letter, sealing it, and leaving it behind. What had stopped him from sending it? Fear, doubt, or something worse? Back in the study, Ellie searched every drawer, every shelf, her movements frantic. She flipped through journals, sifted through envelopes, even checked behind framed photographs. Nothing. Just as frustration began to creep in, her gaze fell on the bookshelf. There, tucked between two dusty volumes of encyclopedias, was a thin, yellowed envelope. Her breath caught as she pulled it free. The address was smudged but legible. Attorney General's office. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable, each letter precise and deliberate. Inside was a single sheet of paper, filled front and back with his neat script. As Ellie began to read, her stomach churned. The letter detailed everything. The land deal, the threats, the names of those involved. It accused Michael of colluding with developers to intimidate landowners, including Joseph himself. Worse, it hinted at something darker. Evidence of tampered brakes on vehicles belonging to anyone who dared oppose the project. Evidence Joseph claimed to have hidden for safekeeping. Ellie sank onto the floor, the letter trembling in her hands. Her uncle, not just a rival, but a predator, a man capable of silencing his own brother to protect his interests. Tears welled in her eyes as the full weight of the betrayal settled over her. Her parents hadn't died in a random accident. They had been murdered. And now, 20 years later, the truth lay in her lap, fragile and undeniable. For a long moment, Ellie simply sat there, the silence of the house pressing down on her. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. This wasn't just her father's story anymore. It was hers, and she owed it to him to see it through. Ellie stared at the envelope in her hands, her father's words still reverberating in her mind. The letter was more than evidence. It was a lifeline to the past, a final message from the man who had loved her enough to risk everything. But as she reread the lines detailing his plans to flee with her mother, a new question surfaced. Why hadn't they left? What had stopped them? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Daniel stood there, his expression shifting from concern to curiosity as he took in the scene. The scattered papers, Ellie sitting cross-legged on the floor, and the faint tremor in her hands. "You found it," he said, stepping inside. His voice was gentle, but there was an edge of urgency beneath it. "What does it say?" Ellie handed him the letter without a word, watching as his eyes scanned the pages. When he finished, he let out a low whistle, running a hand through his hair. "This changes everything," he murmured. "If this ever got out—" "It can't," Ellie interrupted sharply. Her voice softened as she added, "Not yet. We need to understand the whole picture first." Daniel nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "There's something else you should know. That name in the will, Marion Avery. I did some digging. She was your mother's best friend back in college. Moved away after graduation, but they stayed close for years. Then, nothing. No record of her after the early 80s. Ellie frowned, the name sparking no recognition. Why would my parents leave half their estate to someone they hadn't spoken to in decades? Maybe it wasn't about friendship, Daniel suggested carefully. Maybe it was about trust or guilt. The weight of his implication hung heavy in the air. Ellie shook her head, trying to piece together the fragments of her parents' lives. They had always seemed so ordinary, so grounded in the rhythms of small-town life. But now, layer by layer, the facade was crumbling, revealing a world of secrets and shadows she'd never imagined. Later that evening, unable to shake the feeling that something was still missing, Ellie wandered into the living room. The old upright piano sat against the far wall, its lid closed and keys yellowed with age. She hadn't touched it since she was a child, when Ruth used to coax melodies out of her with promises of cookies afterward. As she ran her fingers lightly over the smooth wood, a memory surfaced, a fleeting image of her father kneeling beside the piano, his hands working at something behind the panel. Her heart quickened. Kneeling down, she pressed gently along the edges of the decorative panel until it popped loose. Inside was another envelope, smaller this time, tucked carefully out of sight. Her hands trembled as she opened it, unfolding the single sheet of paper within. It was dated just days before the accident, written in her mother's delicate script. "Dearest Marion, if you're reading this, then Joseph and I are gone. Please forgive us for involving you in our troubles, but we couldn't think of anyone else we trusted more. If anything happens to us, use what we've left you to protect Ellie. She doesn't know the full truth yet, but one day she will. Until then, keep her safe, even if it means keeping her in the dark." Tears blurred Ellie's vision as she read the words again and again, each sentence unraveling another thread of the mystery. Her mother hadn't just been afraid, she'd been planning for the worst. And Marion, this mysterious woman from her mother's past, had been entrusted with half of their legacy, not as a gift, but as a safeguard. Ellie sank onto the piano bench, clutching the letter to her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly grieve, not just for the parents she'd lost, but for the ones she'd never really known. They had carried this burden silently, sacrificing their peace, their happiness, even their lives to shield her from harm. And all these years later, she was only beginning to understand the cost of that silence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Ellie felt a strange sense of resolve settle over her. The answers weren't complete, not yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth about her parents, about Marion, about the life they had tried so desperately to protect. Whatever lay ahead, she owed it to them to see it through. The address Daniel had uncovered led Ellie to a modest home nestled at the edge of a quiet suburb. The house was unassuming, its white siding clean but plain, with flower boxes spilling over with late-season blooms. It looked like the kind of place where life moves slowly and quietly, a stark contrast to the whirlwind Ellie's own world had become. She hesitated on the front step, her knuckles hovering just above the door, before she finally knocked. A moment later, the door opened to reveal a woman in her late 50s, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back into a loose bun. Her eyes were warm but wary, their shape eerily familiar. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice soft but guarded. Ellie swallowed hard, suddenly unsure how to begin. "Are you Marion Avery?" The woman nodded slowly, her brow furrowing. "Yes. Do I know you?" "My name is Ellie Monroe," Ellie said, her voice trembling slightly. She held up the will, still folded neatly in her hands. "I think we're family." Marion's expression shifted instantly, from confusion to alarm, then to something deeper, more complicated. She stepped aside, gesturing for Ellie to come in. The living room was cozy, filled with books and framed photographs that hinted at a life well lived. But it was the photo on the mantel that caught Ellie's eye. A young woman smiling brightly, her resemblance to Clara unmistakable. "I don't understand," Marion said, sinking onto the couch. "Family? What are you talking about?" Ellie took a deep breath and began to explain everything. The will, the letter, the secrets her parents had kept. As she spoke, she watched Marion's face transform, shock giving way to disbelief, then to something softer, almost tender. "You're saying," Marion began, her voice barely audible. "You're saying Clara was my mother?" Ellie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "She gave you up for adoption before she married Joseph. He accepted you as his own, in private. They wanted to protect you, but they also wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of if anything happened to them." Marion stared at her, shaking her head slowly. "I had no idea. All these years, I thought." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, visibly struggling to process the revelation. "I tried to find her once, when I was younger. I wrote letters, hired people to look for her. No one could tell me anything." Ellie's heart ached at the pain in Marion's voice. "They tried to reach out to you too," she said gently. "There's proof in the letters they left behind. But something, or someone, kept you apart." Marion sat in silence for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the floor. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "Why now? Why are you telling me this after all these years?" "Because I think they would have wanted you to know," Ellie replied, "and because I need your help. Whatever my parents were involved in, whatever they were running from, it wasn't just about me, it was about protecting both of us." Marion wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her expression firming with resolve. "Tell me what I need to do." Over the next hour, Ellie laid out everything she'd uncovered, the alternate will, the threats, the missing pieces of the puzzle. Marion listened intently, her sharp mind quickly grasping the implications. By the time Ellie finished, Marion was nodding thoughtfully. "There's a storage unit in my name," she said suddenly. "It's been paid for since I was a teenager, but I never opened it. I always assumed it was empty, a formality from whoever handled my adoption." Ellie's pulse quickened. "Do you still have the key?" Marion stood and disappeared down the hallway, returning moments later with a small metal key clutched in her hand. "Let's go," she said simply. The drive to the storage facility was tense, the air between them charged with unspoken questions and fragile hope. When they arrived, Marion led the way to a narrow unit tucked in the corner of the building. With trembling hands, she inserted the key and turned the lock. Inside was a single box, dusty but intact. Ellie lifted the lid, her breath catching as she saw what lay within. Stacks of documents, photographs, and a worn leather journal. On top was a note in Joseph's handwriting. For Marion and Ellie, together. Ellie glanced at Marion, who met her gaze with a mixture of awe and determination. Whatever secrets lay inside, they would uncover them together, as sisters, as daughters, as the legacy of two people who had loved them enough to risk everything. The confrontation with Michael was inevitable, yet Ellie felt her stomach twist with dread as she pulled into the driveway of his sprawling estate. The house loomed like a fortress, its manicured lawns and towering hedges a stark contrast to the modest home where she'd grown up. It had always been this way. Michael's wealth flaunted, while Joseph lived quietly, content with what he had. Now standing here, Ellie couldn't help but feel the disparity between them wasn't just about money. She knocked on the heavy oak door, her heart pounding as footsteps echoed from within. When Michael opened it, his expression shifted from surprise to something colder, more calculating. "Ellie," he said, his tone clipped, "what brings you here?" "I think you know," Ellie replied, stepping past him into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. She could feel his eyes on her, sharp and unyielding, but she refused to flinch. "I found the will, Uncle Michael, the real one." For a moment he didn't respond, his face unreadable. Then he chuckled, low and bitter. "So that's what this is about, old papers and dead men's wishes." "It's not just about the will," Ellie shot back, her voice rising despite herself. "It's about what happened to my parents. And don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about." Michael's jaw tightened, the casual veneer slipping ever so slightly. "You have no idea what you're digging into, Ellie. Leave it alone before you ruin what little family you have left." "Family," Ellie spat, anger bubbling over. "Is that why you did it? Because they cut you out of their lives, or at least their fortune?" His reaction was instantaneous, a flash of raw fury crossing his face. "Cut me out," he snarled, taking a step closer. "After everything I did for them, after all the sacrifices I made." Ellie recoiled instinctively, but his words struck deeper than any physical blow. "Sacrifices? You mean betraying them? Threatening them? Killing them?" Michael stopped short, his features contorting in shock, and then denial. "Don't be ridiculous. I didn't kill anyone." But there was a flicker of guilt in his eyes, a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. Before Ellie could press further, Daniel appeared in the doorway behind her. He held up a folder, his expression grim. "We found bank records," he said, addressing both of them. "Shortly after the accident, Michael received a significant deposit labeled consulting. Care to explain that?" Michael turned pale, his composure crumbling under the weight of the accusation. For a moment he seemed frozen, caught between rage and panic. Then he lunged toward Daniel, grabbing for the folder. "You have no right," he barked, his voice shaking. "This is slander. Lies." Ellie stepped between them, her resolve hardening. "It's not slander if it's true," she said evenly. "And now we know exactly why you were so desperate to keep us quiet." Michael staggered back, running a hand through his thinning hair. His breathing was ragged, his usual charm replaced by something far uglier. "You don't understand," he muttered, almost to himself. "They left me no choice. Everything I did to protect this family, to keep it whole." "And yet you destroyed it," Ellie countered, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't bother wiping them away. "You killed them, Uncle Michael. My parents. Your own brother." He looked at her then, something resembling regret flashing across his face, but it was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by defiance. "They brought this on themselves," he snapped. "Joseph couldn't let things go. He thought he was some kind of hero exposing the truth. But the world doesn't work that way, Ellie. People don't care about righteousness. They care about power." Ellie stared at him, her chest heaving with emotion. There was nothing left to say. No apology, no justification could undo what he'd done. Slowly she turned and walked toward the door, Daniel following close behind. Outside, the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of what they'd uncovered. Ellie leaned against the car, her legs trembling beneath her. "Do you think he'll confess?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Daniel shook his head. Not willingly, but we have enough to take to the authorities. This ends now. Ellie nodded, clutching the folder tightly. Justice wouldn't bring her parents back, but it would honor their memory and ensure that Michael never hurt anyone else again. As they drove away, Ellie glanced at the documents in her lap, her mind drifting to Marion. Together, they had uncovered the truth, not just about their parents, but about themselves. And though the road ahead would be long and painful, Ellie felt a glimmer of hope. Her family wasn't gone. It had simply been waiting to be rediscovered. The call came late that evening, its urgency cutting through the quiet hum of Ellie's thoughts. It was Daniel, his voice strained but resolute. "You need to come back to Hensley and Company," he said. "Margot's asking for you." Ellie hesitated, exhaustion pulling at her like an anchor. She'd spent hours reliving every word of the confrontation with Michael, replaying his confession in her mind until it blurred into a haze of anger and grief. But something in Daniel's tone told her this wasn't a request. It was necessary. When she arrived at the law office, Margot was sitting upright in her chair, her frail hands gripping the arms as if holding on to the last vestiges of clarity. Her cloudy eyes seemed sharper tonight, piercing through the fog of age and illness. For the first time, Ellie saw not just the woman who had guarded her parents' secrets, but the lawyer who had once fought fiercely to protect them. "You're here," Margot said, her voice steadier than Ellie had ever heard it. "Good. There isn't much time." Ellie knelt beside her, reaching out instinctively to take her hand. "What is it, Margot? What do you need to tell me?" Margot's gaze locked onto hers, unyielding despite the fragility of her body. "Your father didn't trust me completely. Not at first. He came to me because he needed someone outside the family circle. Someone Michael wouldn't suspect. But even then," she paused, swallowing hard, her breathing shallow. "Even then, Michael found out." A chill ran down Ellie's spine. "Found out what?" "That Joseph changed the will," Margot whispered, her grip tightening around Ellie's fingers. "He wanted to cut Michael out entirely, to leave everything to you, Marion, and the trust account meant to expose the land deal. But Michael forced him to sign another version under duress." Ellie's breath caught, her mind racing. "Under duress? How?" "He threatened Clara," Margot replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Told Joseph if he didn't comply, your mother would pay the price. So Joseph signed, but only after making sure I kept the real will hidden." Her lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Michael thought he'd won. He didn't realize your father always planned for the truth to come out eventually." "But the accident," Ellie began, her voice trembling. "Wasn't an accident," Margot finished, her words heavy with finality. "Michael orchestrated it, doctored the scene to look like skid marks, tampered with the evidence. He made sure no one would question it." Ellie felt the room sway beneath her, the weight of Margot's revelation pressing down on her chest. All these years, she'd believed her parents died in a random tragedy. Instead, they had been hunted, silenced by their own flesh and blood. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound she could have imagined. "And you knew?" Ellie asked softly, her voice breaking. "All this time, you knew?" Margot nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I promised Joseph I'd keep the secret until you were ready, until you could handle the truth without breaking." She reached up, cupping Ellie's cheek with a trembling hand. "You're stronger than you think, child, stronger than all of us." Ellie sat there, clutching Margot's hand as the older woman's strength began to fade. Her breathing grew labored, each word more precious than the last. "Take the documents," Margot murmured, gesturing weakly toward a folder on her desk. "Everything you need, it's all there. Use it wisely." With those final words, Margot slumped back in her chair, her eyes closing as sleep, or perhaps something deeper, claimed her. Ellie stayed by her side for a long moment, the enormity of the gift Margot had given her settling over her like a mantle. As she gathered the folder and stood to leave, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression somber yet determined. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Ellie nodded, clutching the folder tightly against her chest. Ready or not, the truth was hers now, and with it came the power to set things right. Whatever lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: Her parents' legacy wouldn't end in silence. The next morning, Ellie sat across from the district attorney, a no-nonsense woman in her early 50s named Laura Hayes. The DA's office was stark and utilitarian, its walls lined with shelves of legal texts and framed commendations. But Ellie barely noticed the surroundings. Her focus was entirely on the folder spread out before her, its contents spilling onto the desk like pieces of a puzzle finally snapping into place. Daniel stood nearby, his arms crossed as he watched Laura sift through the documents. There were bank records showing Michael's suspicious deposits, photographs of the crash site revealing inconsistencies that pointed to tampering, and Margot's sworn statement detailing what she'd witnessed and concealed all those years ago. It was damning evidence, but Ellie knew it wouldn't be enough without someone willing to fight for justice. "This is substantial," Laura said finally, leaning back in her chair. Her sharp eyes flicked between Ellie and Daniel, weighing their resolve. "But reopening a 20-year-old case won't be easy. Are you prepared for what this might uncover?" Ellie nodded, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I have to try. My parents deserve the truth." Laura studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right, let's get to work." Over the following weeks, Ellie became consumed by the investigation. She met with accident reconstruction experts who confirmed what she'd feared. The skid marks at the scene had been staged, and the brake lines on her parents' car showed signs of deliberate damage. Forensic accountants traced the flow of money tied to the land deal, linking Michael not only to the developers, but also to a private investigator known for his involvement in corporate sabotage. Each new discovery felt like another layer peeled away from the lie that had shaped her life. But it wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about confronting the town itself. Many of the people involved in the cover-up were still alive, their power and influence intact. Some refused to cooperate, while others crumbled under questioning, their guilt written plainly on their faces. Through it all, Ellie leaned heavily on Daniel, whose quiet determination kept her grounded when the weight of it threatened to overwhelm her. One afternoon, as they reviewed witness statements in Daniel's small apartment, Ellie paused, staring at a photograph of her parents taken just months before their deaths. They looked so happy, so full of life, a stark contrast to the shadows that had haunted them in secret. "Do you think they ever regretted staying?" she asked softly, more to herself than to Daniel. He glanced up from the papers in his hand, his expression thoughtful. "No," he said after a moment. "They stayed because they believed in doing the right thing, even if it cost them everything. That's who they were." Tears welled in Ellie's eyes, but she blinked them away, focusing instead on the task ahead. Her parents' sacrifices wouldn't be in vain. Not this time. Finally, the day came when Laura called them into her office. The DA's face was grim but resolute as she laid out the findings of their investigation. "We can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the crash was sabotage," she said, her voice firm. "And we've connected Michael Bennett to both the tampering and the conspiracy surrounding the land deal. With this evidence, we're moving forward with charges." Relief washed over Ellie, followed quickly by a wave of grief. Justice was within reach, but it wouldn't bring her parents back. Still, she felt a flicker of peace knowing their story would finally be told, their names cleared of any doubt. As she left the DA's office, the late afternoon sun casting golden light across the streets, Ellie allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. For so long, she'd carried the weight of unanswered questions, the ache of loss compounded by uncertainty. Now, thanks to Margot's courage, Marion's unexpected presence, and Daniel's unwavering support, she was beginning to see a path forward, one paved not just with sorrow, but with hope. Her parents' legacy lived on, not in silence but in truth. And for the first time in years, Ellie felt ready to carry it with her into whatever future lay ahead. The arrest happened on a cold, gray morning, the kind where the sky seemed to press down on the earth like a heavy blanket. Ellie stood at the edge of Michael's driveway, watching as police cars pulled up to the house, their lights flashing silently in the mist. Officers moved with quiet efficiency, knocking on the door and reading him his rights before leading him out in handcuffs. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, not the towering figure who had once intimidated her parents into submission, but a broken man caught in the web of his own making. Ellie felt no satisfaction in seeing him led away, only a hollow ache that settled deep in her chest. Justice was being served, but it wasn't the justice she had imagined in her darkest moments. The statute of limitations had run out on murder charges, leaving only conspiracy and fraud to hold him accountable for the wreckage he'd left behind. Still, it was enough to strip him of the wealth and power he'd hoarded for decades, exposing the rot beneath his polished facade. As Michael was placed in the back of a squad car, his eyes met hers briefly through the window. There was no remorse there, only bitterness and defiance, as if he still believed himself untouchable. Ellie turned away, unable to stomach the sight any longer. She didn't need his apology or his acknowledgement. What mattered was that the truth was finally out. Daniel appeared beside her, handing her a steaming cup of coffee. "It's over," he said softly, his voice carrying both relief and sorrow. "He can't hurt anyone else." Ellie nodded, wrapping her hands around the warmth of the mug. "Doesn't feel real, does it?" "No," Daniel admitted. "But it will, in time." They stood there together in silence, watching as the squad car pulled away, its red and blue lights fading into the distance. The air smelled faintly of rain, a promise of renewal lingering on the breeze. For so long, Ellie's life had been defined by loss and unanswered questions. Now standing here, she realized something fundamental had shifted, not just for her, but for everyone touched by her parents' story. Later that day, she visited Marion, who greeted her with a tentative smile. They sat together in the cozy living room, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of a life rebuilt from fragments. Ellie handed her a copy of the official report detailing the investigation, along with a letter she'd written herself. A letter explaining everything she'd uncovered about their shared past. Marion read it slowly, tears streaming down her face. When she finished, she looked up at Ellie, her expression a mixture of gratitude and wonder. "I never thought I'd know who I really am," she whispered, "or where I came from." "You're my sister," Ellie replied simply, taking her hand. "That's all that matters now." For the first time in years, Ellie felt a sense of closure. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to begin healing. Her parents hadn't lived to see the truth come to light, but they had trusted her to carry the torch, to honor their memory by seeking justice and protecting those they loved. And though the road ahead would always bear the scars of what had been lost, Ellie knew she wasn't walking it alone. As dusk fell, painting the horizon in hues of amber and violet, Ellie stepped outside and looked up at the stars. Somewhere, she hoped, her parents were watching and smiling. When the proceedings began, Ellie felt a strange mix of anxiety and calm. All the evidence they had gathered, the original will, Margot's testimony, the bank records, and the forensic analysis of the crash, was presented methodically, piece by piece. Each document, each witness statement, painted a clearer picture not just of what had happened, but of who Joseph and Clara Monroe truly were. People who valued integrity above all else, even when it cost them everything. Finally, after hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge leaned forward, his gavel resting lightly in his hand. "Based on the evidence presented," he said, his voice steady and clear, "this court validates the authenticity of the will dated date as the lawful last testament of Joseph and Clara Monroe." A wave of relief washed over Ellie, so profound it nearly took her breath away. She glanced at Marion, whose lips curved into a soft smile through tears that mirrored her own. It wasn't about the money or the estate. It never had been. This validation meant their parents' wishes would finally be honored. And more importantly, it affirmed the truth they had fought so hard to uncover. After the hearing, the sisters lingered outside the courthouse, reluctant to part ways just yet. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps, warming the chill in the air. Marion tucked a strand of silver-streaked hair behind her ear, her movements graceful and familiar. Watching her, Ellie couldn't help but notice the subtle echoes of their mother in her mannerisms. The tilt of her head when she listened intently, the gentle strength in her hands as she smoothed the fabric of her coat. "You're so much like her," Ellie murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Marion looked up, startled for a moment before understanding dawned. "Like Clara?" she asked softly, testing the name as if it were fragile. Ellie nodded, blinking back tears. "I see her in you, in the way you care for others, The way you listen, even the way you laugh." She hesitated, then added, "You were a nurse, weren't you?" Marion smiled faintly, nodding. "For 30 years. I always thought it was just something I was good at. But now," her voice trailed off, and she pressed her lips together, visibly moved. "Now I wonder if maybe it came from her, if some part of her stayed with me, even though we never met." "It did," Ellie said firmly, reaching out to take her hand. "She gave you her heart, Marion, and Dad saw that too. That's why they trusted you, even when they couldn't tell you why." They stood there for a long moment, holding on to each other as the world moved around them. Cars passed by, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalk, but none of it mattered. For the first time in her life, Ellie felt whole, not because the pain of losing her parents had disappeared, but because she no longer carried it alone. She had found a sister, a partner in carrying the legacy their parents had left behind. As they walked toward their cars, the conversation turned lighter, punctuated by laughter and shared memories. Marion spoke fondly of her years as a nurse, recounting stories of patients who had touched her life and moments of unexpected joy amid hardship. Ellie listened intently, marveling at how effortlessly they connected, as though decades apart had done nothing to dull the bond they shared. Before parting ways, Marion pulled Ellie into a tight embrace, her arms strong and sure. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me, for telling me the truth." Ellie hugged her back, feeling the warmth of her presence seep into her bones. "Thank you," she replied, "for being exactly who you are." As she drove home, the sun dipping low on the horizon, Ellie allowed herself to imagine what might come next. There would still be challenges ahead. Grief didn't vanish overnight, but she faced them now with a renewed sense of purpose. Together, she and Marion would honor their parents' memory, not just through words or legal victories, but through the lives they chose to live. And somewhere beyond the reach of time, Ellie believed Joseph and Clara were watching, their hearts full of pride. Their daughters had found each other, and in doing so, they had found themselves. The decision came to Ellie one evening as she sat alone in the quiet of the house, the fading light casting long shadows across the walls. She had been going through boxes in the attic, sorting through mementos and relics of a life she was only beginning to understand. Among them was a small wooden box filled with Clara's keepsakes, photographs, pressed flowers, and a delicate silver locket engraved with the word, "Forever." As she held the locket in her hand, a thought occurred to her, clear and undeniable. This house wasn't just a building. It was a vessel for stories, for memories waiting to be shared. Selling it would mean closing the door on something vital, not just her parents' legacy, but the chance to create something new, something meaningful. The idea took shape slowly, like dawn breaking over the horizon. By the time Marion arrived the next morning, Ellie had sketched out a plan. Over coffee at the kitchen table, she laid it all out. A community arts and memory center dedicated to Clara's memory. A place where people could gather to share their own stories, preserve their histories, and find solace in creativity. Marion listened intently, her eyes lighting up as the vision unfolded. "It's perfect," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. "Clara would have loved that." Together, they poured their energy into transforming the house. The study became a cozy library stocked with donated books and journals. The living room turned into an art studio, its walls lined with easels and shelves brimming with paints and brushes. And the old piano, once silent and forgotten, found its rightful place in the corner of what they called the memory hall, a space adorned with photographs, letters, and artifacts from families who wanted to ensure their loved ones were remembered. Daniel helped too, lending his steady hands and practical wisdom to every step of the project. He worked quietly, often staying late into the evenings after the others had gone home, sanding wood or fixing broken fixtures without complaint. One night, as they stood side by side painting the trim around the front door, Ellie glanced at him and smiled. "You know," she said, dipping her brush into the paint can, "you don't have to keep doing all this. You've already done so much." He shrugged, though there was a warmth in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat. "I like helping," he replied simply. "Besides, I think this place suits you." Her cheeks flushed, and she turned back to her work, pretending not to notice the way his gaze lingered on her. But later that week, when they celebrated the completion of the first phase of renovations with takeout pizza and sparkling cider, Daniel stayed behind after everyone else left. Standing in the doorway, he hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Ellie," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I know we've both been through a lot, and maybe it's crazy to say this now, but I care about you more than I expected to." She felt her breath catch, her pulse quickening as she met his gaze. For so long she'd carried the weight of loss, convinced that love was something reserved for younger years. Yet here he was, offering her something unexpected, a second chance at connection, at joy. "I care about you too," she admitted softly, stepping closer. "More than I thought possible." Their first kiss was tentative, almost shy, yet charged with the kind of tenderness that comes from shared struggle and mutual respect. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It didn't need to be. What mattered was the promise it carried, that even in the autumn of their lives, there was still room for love to bloom. On the day of the center's grand opening, the house buzzed with life. Neighbors streamed in, bringing stories and artifacts to display. Children laughed in the art studio, their hands smeared with paint, while older visitors sat in the library sharing tales of days gone by. Ellie wandered from room to room, watching as the visions she and Marion had dreamed up came to life before her eyes. When the crowd thinned and the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellie found herself drawn to the memory hall. The piano sat gleaming in the soft glow of string lights strung along the ceiling. She hadn't played since she was a child, but something compelled her to sit down now, her fingers hovering above the keys. As she opened the bench to retrieve sheet music, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor. Curious, she picked it up and unfolded it, recognizing Clara's handwriting instantly. Her breath caught as she read the words scrawled across the page. "If you're reading this, it means love outlasted fear. Don't let silence bury the truth. We loved you more than life itself." Tears blurred her vision as the weight of those words settled over her. Love had indeed outlasted fear, not just hers, but her parents', Margot's, Marion's, and even Daniel's. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. With trembling hands, Ellie placed her fingers on the keys and began to play, the melody simple and sweet. Outside, the stars blinked into view, their light stretching endlessly across the sky. Inside, the house echoed with music, laughter, and the hum of voices weaving together, a tapestry of memory and hope. For the first time in years, Ellie felt truly at peace. Her parents' legacy lived on, not in grief, but in the connections they inspired, the truths they revealed, and the love that refused to fade.